Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank personally Ajay, the Bharat Krishak Samaj, for inviting me. Um, Terrific that Shekhar, you're here to moderate this, because I think many of these things, many of you probably know much more than I do. I have to say that I'm not an expert on agriculture, I mean. And really, I have to begin with a kind of mea culpa in this. When we wrote the first economic survey, we wrote about industry and services and manufacturing, and actually we did we had one chapter on the APMCs, but not very much on agriculture. And then when we went around presenting it in places, we did get the feedback from a lot of people that we hadn't focused our attentions on agriculture, and that was, I think, a very fair criticism, especially since I think we know Ajay mentioned what's going on. We've had 4 successive seasons of below average rainfall, and international prices have crashed. So farm incomes have been under a lot of stress. So I think we were remiss in the first economic survey in not devoting enough time. But I hope we've made some amends, at least. The second survey, which came out, we have quite a bit on agriculture. So, mea culpa to begin with. The second thing is that I have to say that, in my 18 months here, my ground knowledge of, serious knowledge of agriculture in India was somewhat limited. But I've really learned so much talking to people like Ajay. My guru Harish Damodaran is sitting here. I learned so much reading his columns. Devesh Roy, Ramesh Chand, Ashok Gulati, my colleague Rohit Parmar. Lots of people. So I'm not an expert. I'm not going to say things that are terribly new. I just want to step back and take a kind of distant, slightly academic perspective on this, and I hope to provoke more questions than provide answers. And I hope not to make any gaffes here as a chief economic advisor. So with that, let me begin. I think whenever we talk about agriculture, I think the first question we ask is, why agriculture? I mean, to many of you it may be self-evident, but I really had to think a little bit about why. I think there are 2 broad reasons why agriculture is so important in India. What I would call intrinsic reasons and instrumental reasons. I mean, the intrinsic reasons, I think all of you know, 49% of India's workforce is in agriculture, gets its livelihood from agriculture. And depending on whether you're talking about agriculture or rural sector, somewhere between 40 to 50% of households derive their sustenance from agriculture. So it really is a big deal. And similarly, about 80 to 82% of India's poor are in agriculture or rural sector, which we want to do about it. And then, of course, agriculture provides food security, which I think is really important. So I think so. Bottom line, these numbers are so stark and so important and so big that we can't afford to neglect agriculture. But there is also an instrumental reason. So agriculture as a kind of vehicle or a means to some other end. I think that agriculture does also have the power to hold back the economy as a whole. So that's another reason for I think why we should focus our attention on agriculture. For example, in India we know that inflation is affected by agriculture. We're discovering that even in these last few months or last year, when international prices have come down, inflation has come down. What is keeping inflation high is in fact agriculture. Agricultural, both the wholesale and the CPI are weighted heavily with agriculture and food, and that is affecting, and that via direct and indirect channels affects growth. Interest rates would be lower had inflation been lower and agricultural inflation been lower, which would have affected the economy. So that's one way. I think the other way, very important way in which agriculture affects the rest of the economy, is that what we do in agriculture, for example, just to give you an example, power pricing in agriculture, and I'm not going to take a view on whether it's good or bad. We'll talk about that later, but we know that that affects the price of power for manufacturing. Similarly, credit we provide to agriculture affects the rest of the economy. So agriculture has a very important effect on that. The other, I think, important way is that I think agriculture, the fortunes of agriculture are going to determine the quality of urbanization that we're going to have in India. Whether we're going to have good urbanization or bad urbanization will be determined a lot by what kind of labor migrates out of agriculture. Educated, able to do relatively high-skilled jobs. I think that's one very important. And of course, agriculture can be a source of social stress. I mean, and in many, many ways, we've seen what's happened in the last couple of years. So unless we take agriculture very seriously, I think we're in for a lot of trouble for the economy. And I think it's in some ways, it may not, all this attention on agriculture that we see has been determined by these proximate factors that Ajay pointed out. But in some ways, I think we need to be mindful of agriculture, even regardless of what's happening in the short run for all these reasons. Okay, so why agriculture? Now, for me, it was also very interesting that, we think of agriculture, especially in these times, in somewhat kind of, from somewhat kind of gloomy perspective. But I think it's worth stepping back and understanding that the story of Indian agriculture is not a story of failure. It's a story of many successes. And I want to, outline some of them, some of which, I discovered, again, in the last 18 months. Green Revolution, of course. Imagine the days of droughts in the 60s, the dependence on foreign imports of food, and what that did to us. And then, of course, the Green Revolution changed all that. So in some ways, we're in a very different situation in agriculture from where we used to be. Similarly, we had the White Revolution, and I have to, as an aside, highlight this to some extent because, Raghu and I have written a series of papers saying why foreign aid has actually not been very good for developing countries as a whole, and generally, especially aid in the form of cheap food has very detrimental impacts all over the world, especially in Africa. And in some ways, the White Revolution experience was a real, kind of repudiated that general rule, where in fact these cheap food import, milk powder, was in fact used to develop the indigenous food sector. And of course, the rest is history. So that's really a very interesting success in a way that confounds the general international pattern on this. Then, of course, we had, 6-7 years of the commodity price boom induced dynamism. We know that, in some ways, agriculture had it relatively good because of high international prices from about 2007 onwards. I think what is less well understood is that I think there's been a real spread in the geography and composition of agricultural dynamism. Remember, the Green Revolution was Punjab, Haryana, and some of the southern states. But in the last, I think I would say, 10 to 15 years, that has spread, geographically. Gujarat, Maharashtra, West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh now, to some extent Bihar. And so that geographical spread is actually a very welcome development. And also there's been a spread in terms of, we not just do cereals, but, Gujarat is a cotton success story, Maharashtra is a horticulture story, West Bengal is a potato story, Bihar is a maize story, and of course, Madhya Pradesh is more the conventional cereal story. So, but there has been this spread, which in some ways I think has been really very important. And the last point, I think, is something that this drought has brought home, is that our agriculture has in fact become much more resilient. I'm going to give you one of these probably incomprehensible economist charts to explain this. So this plots, what happens. It's the correlation between rainfall and food production. And you see the 2015 dot, it's actually given how little rainfall we had and that it was a second season, a second year, under normal conditions, it should have been food and agricultural production, that 15 dot should have been much lower, but actually, we're going to get about flat or zero, a little bit positive growth, which I think 10, 15 years ago may not have happened. So I think it's worth acknowledging that basic success story as well. But then we move on then obviously to the challenges. And in some ways, I think there are just, I mean, conceptually to think about agriculture, just two things, two big objectives that we need to think. How do you raise farm incomes and livelihoods? It's all a matter of increasing agricultural productivity. There, I want to tell you a story before or maybe I'll show you the chart first. This is a chart of overall agricultural productivity, and you see India is barely visible. This is value added per worker compared to China, Brazil, Europe, and the United States. You know, I think the numbers are quite staggering. For example, you know, China is 3.7 times more productive, Brazil 7 times, Europe 52 times, and the US almost 100 times more productive. So that is, you know, the distance we have to cover if agriculture really has to be a source of, real increasing farmer livelihoods. But I think I want to all of you to hold this paradoxical thought in your heads, that we have to simultaneously work on improving agricultural productivity, but at the same time, I think people have to move out of agriculture into other sectors. The story of development all over the world is a story of going away from agriculture into much higher productive activities. This is not to denigrate, you know, the value and contribution of agriculture, but it is to recognize the pattern that there are some inherent limitations to agriculture in the long run. And, you know, while we want to, you know, so if we want people to become, you know, really richer they have to move into high productive activities, and therefore, while we have to work to boost agricultural productivity, people have to, you know, en masse move out of agriculture, but under good conditions, not being forced out because of low productivity in agriculture. So just to give you a small personal story, I was in Krishna district of Andhra Pradesh on Saturday. And I mean, what's happening there in terms of the DBT and the jam revolution is just amazing. I do think that Krishna district is the cutting edge internationally of what we can do to bring together, you know, what we call the jam, you know, financial inclusion, biometrics, and mobile, bringing it all together to help the poor. So at the end of the visit, I turned to the collector and said, you know, I was very impressed. What is the per capita GDP of Krishna district? And he said it was 1.1 lakh rupees. It is actually very low. Even for something, it's something like $1,500 or a little bit less, which, you know, is actually very, very. So even a kind of fertile place like Krishna district, very well run, average, incomes are low because it's mostly reliant on agriculture. So it's a kind of thought that, you know, you get rich by moving out of agriculture. Ajay Jhakar apart, of course, and, you know, or Shekhar Gupta apart with their fancy farms. But generally for the common man, you know, you have to, you know, it has to be a transition. I think Mao famously said, you know, the way out of agriculture is industry, but for India, that might be something else. But I mean, the point is the way out is agriculture cannot be a permanent source of livelihood for a large swathe of the population. I think the second major objective is intrinsically agriculture is volatile, so we have to protect farmers against volatility and risk. And here, let me show you a chart that I was actually quite surprised by. This compares agricultural growth in India and China. See, look to the left of this circle. India and China look very similar in terms of volatility. Up and down, highly volatile. But notice what happens in the last 10, 15 years. The blue line is smooth. That's China. They've basically smoothed out volatility, but the Indian thing is still very jagged. And so in some ways, therefore, we have our work cut out a lot, not just to boost productivity, but also to cushion farmers against the downside in India. And that's why I think what the government is doing in terms of the Fasal Bima Yojana and related is actually terribly important on that. Now, having said that the two objectives are productivity and risk, the point is that these objectives have to be attained against the backdrop of what I call the ghost of Malthus. I think there is no question that basic agricultural resources, water, land, soil quality, atmosphere, are becoming scarcer and scarcer. No question. It's partly because of climate change and what is happening to weather around the world. It's partly self-inflicted. I think our domestic policies have led to a situation where some of these things are becoming, depleted. Soil quality depleted for obvious reasons. Water tables going down, again, for obvious reasons. So I think it's happening against a context that is very different today than it may have been, 15, 20 years ago. Now, so the question is, okay, why agriculture is very important. We've had successes, but we face challenges, and against this, I think an environment that's going to become much more difficult. So the question is, what needs to be done? Now, here, I'm going to not stick my neck out, because I can guarantee you that in this crowd, if I were to poll you and ask you what needs to be done to improve agricultural productivity and reduce risk, Ajay's answer will be different from Harish's answer, will be different from Shekhar's answer, and all of you will be right. There are so many things that need to be done in agriculture. It's not funny what all we need to do. So I am not going to spend a whole lot of time telling you or trying to resolve this. I'm just going to run through them very quickly, because I want to pose a more fundamental and deeper question to which I think you will have much better answers than I will. And okay, let me run through the list of things. We all know what we need to do. I think we need to move. See, remember, the Green Revolution and even the 2007 boom in agriculture relied on getting more from more. You put in more fertilizer, you put in more water, you put in more power, you get more output. But now, because of this changing environment, it has to be more from less. We have to rationalize our input use, and whether it's power, whether it's fertilizer, whether it's land, I think we know what needs to be done. Then, of course, we need to create one market in agriculture, and I think the NAM that the government is working on is moving in that direction. We need to build agricultural infrastructure and reduce the role of middlemen. We need to strengthen crop and farm insurance. And of course, you think about land usage in India, we do have fairly small holdings of land which come in the way of raising agricultural productivity. So how do we encourage, land consolidation? And Niti Aayog is now going to put out a model law on land leasing and other things. But, land also has to be worked on to improve agricultural productivity. We know we need to increase the role for science. We know that domestic R&D capability has to be improved. We know that we had a green revolution and now we need a rainbow revolution in pulses. We know, and this is a point that Ajay has made just now, and Harish kind of talks about it quite often in his columns, that there's a lot of policy uncertainty. When international prices are high, we adopt one set of policies. When farm prices are low, we adopt another set of policies, and in the end, we end up hurting farmers in the long run because they're subject to this policy uncertainty, so they don't know, how to base their long-term decisions. Should you base it at an onion MEP of 100, an onion MEP of 300, or an onion MEP of 400, or no MEP at all? So it's a lot of. Then, of course, there are lots of people who will say that, and the Shanta Kumar Committee report also said this, that we need to strengthen institutions, FCI, we all know what needs to be done. On the other hand, we also have ICAR, and many people have views on that. And then, of course, we also need to, rationalize agricultural credit. And by the way, I'm sure this list is not exhaustive. I'm sure I missed out things that many of you know. On this agricultural credit, I will just say, point you all to a study by Ram Kumar and Chavan, which came out. And it's really quite interesting that, we talk about agricultural credit, but, is it too much? Is it really going to agriculture? Is it going to small farmers? Is it going for capital as opposed to short term? These are all, very important questions, and these are not, I think, there's a lot of scope for improvement on this. So, so I can keep adding to the list, and I don't think I will illuminate any of you anymore. So I want to ask the kind of the meta question I want to pose to all of you. No sooner do I say that, or when someone says, Oh, we must have better water conservation. Oh, we must improve, policy uncertainty. To me, the obvious question is, well, why hasn't it happened already? And the deeper question, I think that Shekhar also you will have much better feel for, why isn't good agricultural policy good state level politics? I think that's the deeper question we have to ask. I mean, we know, for example, if you look at agricultural growth and what's happened in the electoral politics of Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal, there has been some correlation between the fact that many of these governments got re-elected in part because agriculture did very well. So there is something interesting happening in India in terms of making good agricultural policy, good politics. But why isn't it happening more widely? I mean, I'm sure they're very simple-minded questions. Why does it not pay you in the polls to avoid droughts, given that so many farmers are going to be affected? The numbers in agriculture are so big that at some level it must be good politics if you actually cater to the needs, the wants, the basic material well-being of millions and millions of farmers. So that's for me the bigger puzzle. Again, when you say why isn't there more investment in water conservation, why is it so difficult to phase out APMCs when we know that the benefits will accrue to lots of farmers? We know it's a few against the many, and in electoral politics, democratic politics, the many should win out. I know you also will have answers, and I'm sure there are good answers, but I think these are the other thing. Why can't the demonstrable success of BT cotton in Gujarat be extended? We know where the opposition is coming from, but this is a demonstrably successful model. Why can't we extend this? And I could keep asking question after question. Why is there still a fear of the private sector despite the many successes which were really private sector driven? Maize, BT cotton, pearl millet, or bajra. And I think we still are hesitant about embracing markets in agriculture. And so that's the other thing which it's kind of again a very obvious point. We did, my team did some work on fertilizer, and if you think about it, fertilizer policy in India, we said this in the economic survey, actually ends up hurting the small farmers because there are black markets in fertilizer, which actually impact much more on small farmers than big farmers. The same thing is true with seeds. So again, why is it that if there are many, many more small farmers and very few big farmers, why isn't politics kind of rearrange itself to make these things advantageous? So I think these are the bigger questions, I think, for us to ponder over, before we recommend solutions. We say, that's why I open the newspapers and, every day there are, no dearth of, advice in terms of what needs to be done in agriculture. But I think, how this can be, part of electoral politics is, I think, the deeper question that, I'd love all of us to discuss. I'm almost finished. I'm going to. So here's a kind of just a stepping back and a kind of a bigger what can be done. If you think about it, that there's so much government intervention in agriculture. Just do the following thought experiment. What if the government just did two basic things in agriculture? One, big public investments like the Gram Sadak Yojana, the R&D, the extension, providing truly public goods. Public goods, by the way, which if you think about the Green Revolution, it was the agricultural extension services as much as the technology that contributed to the Green Revolution, and yet we know now what the state of extension services in India is. So maybe the government should focus on just providing a lot of public goods, public investment, one. And second, I think we have to be realistic, at least for some period, that there will be a huge part of Indian farming that may not provide enough livelihood to people. So I think maybe we should be thinking about also, this is, providing some basic income support to, I don't want to draw the line how many farmers, but, some, significant portion of farming where it's unviable, productivity is low, returns are low. Maybe we should be thinking about providing, and then maybe once you do all this, all these other interventions that we do, maybe we can just kind of roll it all into this big one, and then let agriculture kind of boom in a way that I think it has a lot of potential to happen. So this is just a basic, a kind of a big thought I want to leave you with. Now, as I said, the question is, what is going to drive change in agriculture? I said, somehow it has to be made of politics. But I want to end with, I think, two things. I think there is no doubt about the fact that in the last 2 years, the result of the last 2 years, the general rule that crisis leads to reform and change, which we saw for the economy more generally in 1991, I think has also been true in this, because I do think that this budget and this government has spent a lot of time thinking about how to support agriculture. For example, in the budget, the Gram Sadak Yojana allocation was increased. We've been very mindful of the fact that we've wanted to incentivize pulses production, and therefore the MSP in pulses have been increased by significant amounts over the last 2-3 seasons. I think the Fasal Bima Yojana, which I said was happening, was also very important. Opening up to FDI in agriculture, provided the goods are produced. I think mission mode on the Krishi Sinchai Yojana. So I think this in some ways crisis has led to a very positive and significant response in terms of addressing agriculture. Obviously, much more remains to be done. I think we need to, but let's take advantage of this opportunity. In some ways, supposing we have 2 good monsoons, or good monsoons that Ajay talked about, which of course we all want, one collateral might be that the temporary improvement in the fortunes of agriculture might once again lead to a kind of long-term inattention to agriculture, which we need to be a little bit more watchful about going forward. I want to end with a really a point which economists have no business to be making. Robert Solow is a Nobel Prize winner. He once said that when most discussions about economics and economic growth, they begin with a great deal of rigor, academic rigor, and end in a blaze of amateur sociology. So I'm going to end in this blaze of amateur sociology. I think there is one deep problem about agriculture, why it's maybe not got the attention. I do think that the crisis has, of course, focused attention, but I think that somewhere along the line, agriculture doesn't resonate as much as it used to. Think of, and this is also in terms of the talent that's been attracted to agriculture. I know this is, if I say things that, I shouldn't be, but, in some ways, how do we attract the best talent? If you think back, M.S. Swaminathan, C. Subramanian, the great academic economists, K.N. Raj Krishna, in some ways, we don't have those, Verghese Kurian, for example, icons, agricultural people were icons, whether in academics or actually as scientists or farmers or politicians. And in some ways, I think something has happened to the sociology of agriculture. I think that something has happened along the way. And I think unless we get that back, I think that, we're going to struggle and struggle, because I do think that, resurrecting farmer livelihoods in India is absolutely must be top priority for the country as a whole. Thank you very much.